Sales generally is harder than it's ever been. And every year the stats show it's getting harder. There's a really interesting organization called the Bridge Group. They research SDRs, BDRs, and every year they do like an annual report. Looks at about 365 odd businesses. So pretty sizable. They measure a lot of things. One thing I find really fascinating is their stats on like activity and outcome. Every year, essentially, there's a drop in outcome. So they track one thing, it's called quality conversations daily. So it's like, how many engaged conversations am I getting, email or phone? And since 2014, I think it's dropped like 55%, about 10% a year since 2014. So sales is getting harder.
Initiating becoming a hiring machine sequence in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, it's Sam Keenley, and welcome to Becoming a Hiring Machine. This is the show dedicated to fixing recruitment by going beyond saying what needs to change and instead teaches you how to make that change. Today we have a great Tactical Tuesday episode ahead of us, but before we get into that, I just want to tell you a little bit about the show. Essentially, we have shows within the show here. Some days we have interviews with industry thought leaders and others who are shaking up the space, while other days we cover things like trending topics. Stop by every Tuesday like today for a Tactical Tuesday episode where we go deep on how to do something that's going to help you drive better results in your day-to-day. Some days we open up for Q&A, and other days you get a mic drop episode from Matt where he shares something he's been thinking about within the recruitment space and wants you to know. Now, as a reminder, if you love the content that we share here on the show, make sure that you subscribe for more. All right, for today's Tactical Tuesday, we're going to unpack a topic that's near and dear to so many recruiters' hearts, and that is cold calling. Why does it seem like it's getting harder every year? Why aren't my talk tracks working like they used to? Should I be approaching things differently? Lucky for us, we have Will Burry, the CRO, Chief Revenue Officer at VXT, a leading communications platform designed specifically for recruiters to help us answer these questions. Will, welcome to the show.
Cheers, Sam. Thanks for having me along. Glad to be here.
And I know we were talking right before the show. This is one of your first podcasts that you've been on, so audience here gets a special
Super
treat
excited.
with you.
Yeah, very excited.
Good. All right. So, cold calling. You scroll on LinkedIn, you talk to someone at a Facebook group or at a local event. You're always going to hear some form of like, "Oh, cold calling's dying. Cold calling's dead." Meanwhile, you're seeing quite the different story on your side. So before we start to unpack this, like, why do we think that recruiters and like just anyone really who goes about business development is struggling with cold calling more than ever before?
I think it's interesting. I think sales generally is harder than it's ever been, and every year like the stats show it's getting harder. There's a really interesting organization called the Bridge Group. They research SDRs, BDRs, and every year they do like an annual report. Looks at about 365 odd businesses, so pretty sizable. And they measure a lot of things. One thing I find really fascinating is their stats on like activity and outcome. And every year essentially there's a drop in outcome. So they track one thing, it's called quality conversations daily. So it's like how many engaged conversations am I getting, email or phone? And since 2014, I think it's dropped like 55%, about 10% a year since 2014. So sales is getting harder.
Yeah.
But interestingly, BDRs and SDRs whose primary channel is calling see about a 1.4 times increase in the amount of quality conversations per day as opposed to like email-centric salespeople. So sales is harder. Calling is definitely not dead, but it's definitely like a shifting landscape, and I think everyone has to be kind of ready to adapt, right, and try new things, and can't be too stuck in the way things have been back in 2014 or when they first started.
The whole predictable revenue model fun. And that's so interesting that, you say that it's become less effective about 10% every year. And I know part of that did stem from that predictable revenue model. If you make 50 calls a day, if you send 50 emails a day, and that number keeps going up 10% every year, 60, 70, 80, 90. But it does seem like people are cutting back more on calling and pushing harder on email. So do you think that's part of why this is actually working a little bit better or something different?
Yeah, potentially. I think the easiest lever to pull is just more activity. Quality conversations are dropping every year, so let's just increase the amount of calls we do to match what we did last year as far as outcomes. I personally don't think that's a very effective strategy. I think you're better to look at like improving the activity you're doing, so improving your emails, improving your calling, and you should see a significant lift in that.
I know you prepared some. I asked you before this, like, what do you think recruiters, sales reps, people can be doing to improve some of their efforts? Just given you've probably had how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of calls go through you all at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're up to about 5 million phone calls now through VXT.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, just a couple here or there, no small change.
Yeah, the odd call.
Yeah. So what are you seeing with some of that our listeners can start to understand and use towards how they can improve their own business development efforts?
I think it's a really interesting topic. A lot of what I think about calling applies to sales generally. So I think, what from like an approach perspective, what works for calling will work for emails, will work for LinkedIn. But I think one thing that's really kind of coming to light now is like how important being relevant and being and personalizing your approach is. I think look back a couple of years, emailing was king. I could send an email to 100 people, the same email to 100 people a day, and I'm pretty likely to get some replies and some engagement. Now with really like polished automated systems, everyone's drowning in emails. So doing something other than sending hi Sam, quirky observation, it's not going to work anymore.
Yeah.
So I think nailing relevance is important. Understanding why is today the right time for for me to reach out to Sam, what's happening in Sam's business, as specific as possible, instead of just making kind of like broad observations. Oh, hey Sam, I saw your business has grown 15% year on year. I think that makes a huge difference. And I think there's a lot of ways you can do that too, quite easily and at scale. And there's some really cool like resources out there for that too.
Mm-hmm. So I definitely want to get a thought on at least one of those from you, but I want to reiterate what you just said. You really need to nail the relevance and get specific with that outreach. I don't think many people are doing that. And to your point, like that is such a great way to break through the noise, because people on the receiving end, they can tell if something was copy and pasted to 100 people versus this was obviously written for me. So like, how are you seeing that play out a little bit on your side?
Good question. Yeah, I think it works. For us, emails is a really good method for that, and calling, of course, works as well. I think we see about a double in our kind of engagement when we really focus a lot less on like the volume and on hitting that relevant side. So it's about it doubles our kind of engagement from calls and emails. So massive kind of shift there.
Mm-hmm. I believe it. Yeah. And whether that's sending the email, and then are you seeing that if someone does that, then they follow up with a phone call later on? I'm sure that it's more well received, like because they probably did read the email. It's like, hey, this is Will from VXT. It's like, oh yeah, hey Will, what's up? Or at least they have that level of familiarity with you or the company.
Yeah, it's 100% true. I think not like any individual engagement is going to convert. I think it's the collective effort, right? It's a LinkedIn message. It's the the email that has an understanding about the person, and then maybe it's the phone call that does it, or maybe it's the next email that does it. It's I don't think you can only call or only email and see really good results. I think it's a combination of both that will achieve the best outcomes.
Yeah. So what's one way that you're inserting relevance or something specific into the call? Like, what are you researching beforehand, or how are you incorporating that into an opener or building rapport with them early on?
Yeah, good. It's an interesting concept for us. It's it's a little different than it might be for a for a recruiter doing BDR work. Is one thing we really focus on is, for example, the applicant tracking system someone's using. We work with a lot of recruiters, and knowing that someone uses Loxo and being able to kind of reference that and talk to that is probably the number one thing we've seen that shifts our engagement across all channels. Short of that, knowing that someone's hiring and being able to talk to that is also really valuable, and often for us they kind of we're able to kind of incorporate those at the same time.
Okay. I like those. Yeah. So being able to, shed some light into I know what kind of platforms you're using, I know the system or the process and what you're going through. So shows you did some of your research. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Anything, it's funny. I feel like, and I'm not sure what the stats show on this, but any level of personalization is enough. Because all it's really saying is I'm not a robot, I'm a person. And there's been some interesting kind of anecdotal people I've spoken to have spoken about even spelling mistakes. Having minor imperfections in your emails is a good thing. But emailing is a whole nother kind of story around deliverability of emails as a whole, science on itself, right?
That's fascinating. That makes sense because, yeah, in the age of AI and ChatGPT, they don't make spelling errors. They know the difference
Yeah,
between
yeah, it's very
THERE and
predictable.
THEIR, right? Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So what's next on your list of other things that recruiters can do with calling?
Yeah. So the next thing I kind of stress with our, especially with our new hires, is like don't skip practice and review. Make time to look at the calls you're doing. Like look at your script. Um, review what's working well and what's not. If you just keep going at the same thing, it might work, but there's potentially a better strategy that you haven't thought about or you haven't looked at. And if you have colleagues, practice with them. If you keep running into the same objection and it's really hard to get through it, and you find yourself getting tongue tied on one part, sit down with your colleague for half an hour and say, hey, look, let's workshop something I can say, like a one liner, two sentences maybe, and practice that, and you'll see massive improvements in just getting through those kind of tricky parts of the calls, and then you can focus more on on the next hurdle that you run into.
Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people like to use scripts for BDR work. I mean, when I first got started, that's what I had my general template that I would follow. And I remember I spent a week writing out this perfect script and everything else. And then I read it on the first call. I'm just like, that does not sound like me and how I talk at all. So to your point of, talk through things where you stumble or anything else, you're going to quickly find out, okay, what do I need to tweak? So when I get on a phone with someone, it's conversing how I actually talk in my day-to-day, not how I want to appear in the written format.
Yeah, for sure, right? If you read someone your email, if you spoke like you're doing an email every day, everyone's gonna look at you kind of weird. Um,
Yeah.
there's some really good software out there as well that you can use to essentially record and analyze, and something that VXT can do as well. But like listening back to your calls,
Mm-hmm.
the good calls and the bad calls, I think for me, like the most valuable ones to listen to. It's hard to listen to yourself sometimes, but I think there's a lot of value in listening to yourself and understanding how many ums and ahs you say, and where do you think you sound really good, and kind of celebrate that internally with the rest of your team. But definitely, don't be afraid to listen to yourself and kind of reflect on maybe what's not working so well.
Mm-hmm. I like that. That's such a good tip too. It's people want to listen to what did I speak to really well on
Mm.
calls. If you do want to focus on cleaning up your filler words, the ums, the ahs, the likes, you'll hear that very quickly when you
Oh
do
yeah.
go and listen to your call. You think to yourself, I did not say that much, and then you're 5 minutes in, you've got a tally it up at 25 already, and you're only a tenth of the way through the call. So that's a great point, and really just figuring out where do you stumble, where do you struggle, and then like you said, grab a buddy, start working through some of those to just coach yourself up on it some more.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you are in like a leadership position, it's also something that you can quite easily involve in your kind of your weekly catch ups with your team members as well.
Mm-hmm.
Look through and listen through calls together and discuss calls with like with your direct reports or even your manager, depending on your position. I think it's a great way of kind of iterating on what's working well and improving what's potentially not working quite so well.
Mm-hmm. That's a great learning point. Love that one. All right, next one.
Cool. The next one is ensure the data you have is accurate. The average rep makes 40 phone calls, sends 40 emails a day. If let's say 20 of those get to the right place, great. Let's say the other 20 don't. Okay. You're missing 20 great opportunities, and so yeah, I think it's all about calling the right people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, calling the right phone number, right? It's often a big one. Are you calling a direct line, like in someone's personal phone number, or are you calling a general intake line, and having to kind of fight your way past the gatekeeper before you can actually speak to the right person. So I think it's like a huge one is focusing on the data you have and making sure that those 40 calls are the most like effective calls they can be.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good one. How are you going about ensuring that you either have good data, good information to make that, or are there any tools, procedures that you use to go and find that information if you don't have access to it?
Yeah, there's a lot of good tools out there. So things like Lucia, Zoom Info, Apollo. There's a lot of tools essentially just selling data. I think interestingly enough, like my phone numbers are like widely available online, which is I'm not super comfortable with it often, but it's very like we looked on them, and even my personal mobile was there, for example. Um, so it is very easy to get the data, and I think it's worth the investment. I think each of those platforms I just mentioned, they excel at different regions. So understanding kind of who your clients are is, I guess, is also a really important concept. Instead of saying, hey, look, I sell it to every human. It's like, okay, maybe you sold insurance, but you're probably not selling insurance. So understand that, okay, I might be selling to recruiters, for example. So one of those platforms might have better data on recruiters and specific locations and other adjacent industries.
Yeah, and unfortunately for you, we're one of those platforms. We have all the personal information because that's who recruiters want to reach out to at the end of the day. So, yeah, we've got personal contact information in terms of emails, in terms of your phone numbers and everything else. But I want to just hone in on that part because that's what a lot of our listeners do have is access to both. A lot of them have, Loxo has both, but many of them have a Zoom Info license or a Lucia license for the B2B side. Do you usually recommend, for biz dev purposes, reaching out if you have their office number, their direct number, their cell phone number? Like, which of those are you finding good success with?
The direct number, always. Yeah, if you can skip the front desk, fantastic. The US is a little different, as mobile numbers and landlines look the same as far as like number structure goes. Outside of the US, often like a mobile number is a very different format. So for example, like in New Zealand, your like a landline has like a geographic element to it, so you can tell what region it's from, whereas a mobile number is the same no matter where you are. So if you're outside the US, always call from a mobile number. You're a person, not a business, so mobile numbers look a lot more personable and people will answer a lot more. If you're in the US, your mileage may vary. I'm not too sure kind of the regionality on it, but calling from a local number is definitely going to be a huge uptake.
Yeah, and I think that's why in the US you're seeing a lot of the softwares that are auto making it look like you're calling from the area code that I grew up in. I'm just like, no one grew up in that area code. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
So okay, I like that one. What's next?
Next one. Don't skip discovery. So this is often, it's like a saying that gets thrown around a lot in sales, is people don't buy products, they buy solutions. So don't gloss over learning about the person you're speaking to before you start pitching your solution. I think the first question is, it's like, do they even need your solution? Is the first question you should try answer. And if you can't get a really good answer to that, it's like, probably don't waste your time and maybe dial someone else. So yeah, I'd say like seek to understand kind of like where the prospect or the person is today. What's going on in their business today that might not be going well. Where do they want to be in the future? What is their like dream situation, and how can your solution get them there? Is kind of the question I always try to answer. Is okay,
yeah.
You want to be in a really efficient state. Yeah.
Do you have a good question that you usually can, or like one or two question examples that people can think about and kind of put their own flavor to?
Yeah. Try to think something relevant for like a kind of BD and a kind of recruitment perspective. I'm not too sure if I have anything like kind of super specific around that. But essentially anything that's like where would you what's going well today, what's not going well today, and maybe like if you could change one thing about your process around this, what would it be? So from like a VXT, it's like, hey, look, the average person spending 5 to 10 minutes documenting phone calls and doing phone admin. If you didn't have to do this, what would you do? It's quite like a nice way of kind of like wrapping it.
Yeah, and I think the brilliant thing about that is that they're open-ended questions. It gets them to talk. It's not you trying to guess and get them to say yes or no to confirm or deny something. It's letting them guide you, and you're going to be able to craft your pitch after that, after the proper discovery.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's so much easier to pitch when you know a lot about the person, you've done the discovery. Pitching before that is kind of, you're casting a very, very broad net, where if you've done the discovery right, you only need to say a couple things, and then everything else just kind of falls into place.
I like that one. That's a good one. Ooh, okay. And then I think we've got one more. Is it that you've got for us?
I got a couple more here.
A couple more. Still. Ooh, extra. Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right, let's keep them going.
Cool. So the next one, this is a bit more general, but it's like meet your clients where they are. So, and this goes for all industries and all selling. If you're speaking to recruiters, LinkedIn's a great channel. If you're speaking to electricians, LinkedIn might not be the best channel. So understanding, kind of who your clients are, where they are, how they buy, is a really like fundamental part of selling and investing your time in the right kind of areas.
And having that omni-channel presence with them. So when you do finally make that call, I'm going to keep tying everything back to calling if you can't tell. But so when you finally do call, it's not just this random like, Will, who are you? I've never heard of you, never seen you, never heard of your company. Hopefully they'll have, seen that you commented on a post, you drop them a message somewhere. They may not have replied, but at least there's that small grain of familiarity that they may have when they do answer the call.
Definitely. Yeah, I think to that point, content is super important and don't neglect it. If you are doing that kind of omni-channel approach, making sure your brand and your business's brand is visible. I mean, podcasts, right? Having a podcast is a great way of doing this. Posting on LinkedIn, and it's a great way of building that kind of brand presence. When you do pick up the phone, you say, "Hey, look, Will here from VXT." People are like, "Oh, I know that brand. I know what they stand for. I know what they do." As opposed to you pick up the phone and you have to explain who you are. If you ever caught explaining who you are, it's a much trickier conversation than if someone already knows who you are, and and then you just go straight into the into that kind of discovery stage.
Yeah, a little bit more of an uphill fight, and that's why I always say I love brand marketing done well, because not only are your marketing numbers going to go better, but your BDR and your sales activity are all going to go better too, because they don't have to explain who you are, what you do in the first 5 minutes. They should, if you're doing it properly, they'll have a good brand affinity, or at least like think well of you and be much more receptive to taking that call as a result.
Yeah, definitely. I think even something simple as knowing, let's say for example, I'm calling a recruitment agency. I know an agency very similar to them who's already using our software. And say, hey, look, we're working with this business. They have a lot of similarities to you guys. Just wanted to call to make just to say, hey, look, worked for them, probably will work for you as well. Potentially don't have to be so kind of broad as that, but yeah.
Yeah, I like it. All right, let's keep it rolling.
Cool. The last thing, and I think this is like, again, super applicable to all parts of sales and definitely calling, is don't be afraid to try new things. The sales landscape's constantly changing. What worked yesterday may not work tomorrow. So always like look to innovate and and improve on the current processes and what you're doing today.
I like that one, and it's so important too, because this is something I talked about in a previous episode. Is there's the concept of like what I call trending best practice, where something starts to gain traction in the market, it works really well, but it's fleeting. And so as soon as the mass adopts it, it's no longer best practice, because that's become the same thing that you see in the inbox, using a first name in the subject line, insert any tacky outreach strategy tactic that we've all seen so far. So to your point, how do you stay ahead of that is by constantly testing, iterating, and comparing that to your benchmark and see like, oh, I should lead with this, or I should do this sequence or something else. So like, what's one or two things that you or your team have been testing and trying new things with lately?
Can't give away all the trade secrets, right? What's something new that's like really stood out? I think like from like an email, like subject lines is a really interesting like space of an email, because it's the first thing people read and it's super eye catching. Funny enough, no subject line works really, really well, like way better than it should work. As opposed to some kind of like almost like a pitch inside the subject line. Calling, I think everyone talks about like, hey, let them know it's a cold call to start off with. To what you said earlier, you can write a beautiful script, but if it doesn't sound like something a human would say, it's probably not going to work. So something that like we have focused on and focus on a lot is just trying to have a conversation with someone. We have a script in the sense that these are the areas we want to touch on. These are some kind of common objections. These are how to, some kind of 1 to 2 lines how to handle them. But for the most part, your focus should be learning about the person, and just having a conversation, and everything else will take care of itself. If you're kind of nailing that, everything else is easy. But it's definitely the hardest part of calling.
Setting yourself up for success with it. All right, now I have one final question thought for you, a little curveball at the end. It's not so much a curveball, but just curious. Voicemail. What's your take on voicemail? Because I've seen it swing both ways, where when I started, every call had to have a voicemail left. Now I can go look at my phone at the end of the workday. I'll have 10 missed calls from numbers I don't know, not a single voicemail.
Yeah. We would often do like multiple calls in like series in our sequence. It might be like, let's say, for example, 3 calls. I would only ever leave a voicemail on the last call. It of course depends a lot. So if for example the person's engaged with your content a lot, has replied to an email, voicemail is a fantastic tool. If they have no idea who you are and it's very much a cold call, voicemail is probably not the best because you can't do discovery over a voicemail. The best thing you can do is pitch, and you don't really want to be pitching. So I would say avoid the voicemail if possible, unless they're expecting the call.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, and that's one that I don't have an answer for. I've been trying to crack too, because I always wonder, I was like, when I look at my phone and I see those 10 calls and not a single person left one, I'm like, that's an opportunity to stand out. But at the same time, if it's a pitch, well, I'm definitely not going to answer the next time if I know I don't want it. But if they leave a good voicemail that's relevant, I might answer. Like, so that's where it's hard to know. And to your point, test. You'll never know if you don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. I like it. Well, this was phenomenal. This was incredibly helpful. I think it definitely dispels the cold calling is dead myth. No, most recruiters, especially those who've been at it for a while, are just like, yeah, Sam, Will, no duh, we know this. That's why we're continuing to call all the time. But a lot of the new up-and-comers and other places that are trying to just focus on volume over email and LinkedIn, hopefully this is a good little piece of advice and something that they listen to as they start to rethink some of their outreach strategy. So as we wrap, any places that you'd recommend people go to learn about you, VXT, cold calling, or calling in general, that you want to share?
LinkedIn's great. We post a lot on LinkedIn, so VXT does a lot of content there. As far as calling and sales generally, there's a couple I really respect. There's a group called Flip the Script. They do a lot on kind of the personalization and relevance. I think they're super interesting. And then there's an organization called the Bridge Group who do that kind of study I mentioned on kind of BDR, SDR activity, but they have a lot of like interesting insights into the industry, generally speaking.
I love it. Well, I'm going to go check those out right after we end this one. So appreciate those. All right, Will. Well, I appreciate you coming on, sharing this knowledge with us. I know it's hopefully going to inspire and motivate some recruiters who may feel a little bit down on cold calling, get them to rethink some of the approaches that they're taking. So truly appreciate you coming and joining us. So
pleasure to be here, Sam.
Yeah. All right. So as we wrap, Becoming a Hiring Machine is a production of Loxo. If you loved this episode, which I know you did, and you're not sure where to go next, we've got a link to a similar one in the show notes, and you can find that in the description of your favorite podcast streaming platform. If you ever have questions, send them to us, podcast@loxo.co, or you can find Will on LinkedIn. I bet he'd be happy to answer anything as well. And if you love this episode, make sure you leave us a quick rating in your podcast streaming platform. It takes 3 seconds and helps other recruiters like you to find us. So, all right, everyone, that's the show. That was a phenomenal Tactical Tuesday with Will from VXT. Until next time, bye y'all.